Welcome, friends and familials and familiars. If there's a cat listening right now, you're welcome. And you're welcome to wander off as cats often do. If we're not holding your attention, special kitty, then, go do cat stuff. But I'm here with Ramzy Abueita, and I am Zachary, a nonsense man. And this is a program that is yet to be named. We have a topic, though. What is our topic today?
The topic is, if I recall correctly, how might psychedelics help the world?
How might they? What is the might, as in like mighty? How might these mighty mushrooms and other magical molecules possibly assist humanity in the situation that we are currently in, which I'm problematically optimistic, some people say, but it's a situation. It's a bit of a conundrum. We have problems. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, I think the world has a few problems.
Mm. And some that seem so deeply rooted and not to mince words, on a collision course with cataclysmic catastrophes abound, seem almost inevitable. But these these psychedelics have a way with humans that I've seen be miraculous on a small level. So yeah, I guess what we're gonna try to what we're going to talk about, but what we're gonna try to perhaps employ the the healing power of conversation. Let me try to say that in a less hippy dippy kind of way. The pragmatic potential of dialectic. We're going to try to employ that today to see to float some ideas of how psychedelics might save the world. No, just how that might help. How might psychedelics help? How have psychedelics helped you, Ramzy?
I think the conversation is fascinating, and this is a theme in that has been in the psychedelic space since the 60s. Early on in the early psychedelic circles, like at Harvard and other places, especially like in the Timothy Leary spaces, psychedelics were kind of like heralded as these tools that were going to usher in this messianic era. And I think one of the things that really brought a lot of notoriety to Timothy Leary was how much he championed psychedelics as this, savior of mankind. And I think since then there has been an attenuation of, that messianic fervor of the power of psychedelics. The thing is, I totally understand, both sides of this dynamic, both sides of the conundrum. Psychedelics are very powerful. There is a lot of potential. However, chalking them up as a panacea, as the absolute antidote for all the world's problems, might be a little naive. There are some problems that are so convoluted that, dare I say it, not even the psychedelic medicine, is the ultimate solution. But I think that there are ways to figure out how they can be an asset, how they can, be a tool, for healing, a tool for, mind expansion, a tool for breaking out of reality tunnels and, connecting into new modes of thought, connecting into new worldviews, connecting into, new empathic states of mind where you're able to break out of the modes of thought that have defined your previous interaction with the world and usher in a new mode of thought. And I think that having that in mind kind of like allows us to, look at the bigger picture and be like, okay, in what ways can the world benefit from having people break out of, their conditionings, and in what ways can the world benefit from having people tap into new states of empathy? In what ways can the world benefit from having people all of a sudden come into awareness of interconnectedness and deep ecology. And I think these are the themes that we have to discuss when we talk about the power of psychedelics and how they're able to, usher in, a new era of, abundance and healing and healing the world.
Yeah, I think it's very important to put an emphasis on the word assist. Psychedelics may assist. They can assist us. They are not an antidote. Uh, I I like to just lay out there that my adolescent self, I mean my more adolescent self, I still have some pretty adolescent tendencies, but my let's call him 25-year-old Zachary would go around saying stuff like these things just fix us. They just make us moral. You eat the mushroom and it shows you the way. Not to say that Terrence McKenna said that, but it's like what I have come to know, and what I would like to admit wrong that past Zachary, and there's so many iterations of this archetype of naive adolescent psychedelic Jesus who has the revelation. It's like, oh my God, we're gonna save the world. Just all we need to do is dose the water supply, and that's it. It's fucking utopia. They help. They are a tool. They are an assistant. They're a power up, and the effort needs to still come from individuals and groups and communities. There is no way around that the problems that we have will require effort and patience and, dare I say, love. Like this empathy we speak of. It is not. It's not like getting proficient at a slap shot or a slam dunk, or improving your drive, whether on the disc golf or analog golf course. It's empathy is a fuckaroozy of a thing to experience and to deepen, and 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 more of us having more of a deeply wired in sense of empathy that is not a switch that is flipped, that is just there. You do. I mean, that is one thing that I would say that becoming more familiarized with, particularly from my own experience, the states that the psilocybin and ayahuasca, and there's this phenomenon that I experienced that others have said as well, that since I familiarized myself with the ayahuasca state, when I take large doses of mushrooms now, I go to ayahuasca almost identically. I even taste it in my mouth. I purge the same way. It's everything. But since I can take psilocybin mushrooms and essentially be on ayahuasca, I don't know how to differentiate the things. Anyway, that's just a strange phenomenon that I've heard several others report that. But anyway, those states, I'll stay away from the neuroscience, but the tryptamine family, but I'll just specifically psilocybin and ayahuasca. That's what I have experienced. That place, the more I go there, the more I imbue myself. That's a good word to use. These things can imbue you with an inescapable empathy, to the point where it's difficult for me now to remain in a villain hero, good evil, uh, an enemy relationship. It's difficult because I have imbued myself over and over again, and I'm sure that can fade too, and I'm sure that there's things that I could do to override. But there's this empathy going now, and it's not just like the psychedelics that did it, but I do very much feel that they have the potential to imbue you with an empathy that makes it so you almost can't avoid the reflex to seek understanding. And we need to seek a bunch of very difficult understanding right now in order to be on a better path as a species, I think.
Yeah, I think those are really excellent observations. And, you know, where I want to kind of like frame the, you know, kind of like macro dynamic of what psychedelics kind of like do. Um, First of all, I think it's worth mentioning what the default, you know, MO of most of society is, you know, absent, you know, psychedelic, you know, interfacing. I think most people, they're born and are immediately, you know, indoctrinated into what I'll call reality tunnels. You know, people are born into families, people are born into societies, people are born into cultures. And through the families, you know, people are immediately indoctrinated into the family values. I think it's pretty common and understandable that religions run in families and oftentimes political views run in families. So immediately, you know, when a person is born, they're immediately thrust into a context where they have these political and religious views of the immediate social environment put upon them. And, you know, the most immediate one is the family, the nuclear family, or, you know, whatever iteration of that. And then subsequently, you have things such as elementary school, and whatever the local culture of, you know, the teachers, your classmates, and stuff like that. So, you know, being born, you know, you're immediately put into this environment where you're soaking in the conditioning from your parents, your peers, your teachers, your schoolmates, TV, television, you know, like whatever programming is on TV. You soak in the implicit cultural indoctrinations of television and radio and culture and all these things. And ultimately what this leads is most people are immediately kind of confined to a set of constraints of what defines their thought. And these indoctrinations can be really, really stubborn, you know, because if that's all a person knows, if all a person knows is the reality that has been, you know, pushed upon them by their immediate social context, their immediate social environment, then how else would they know anything otherwise? And then there's also this kind of like reinforcement effect where there tends to be this collective groupthink where ideas have immune systems. And, you know, there is a sort of collective, you know, cognitive dissonance whenever, you know, if ideas get presented that kind of like contradict what the dogma is of the society, they tend to be stomped out pretty quickly by people's peers, you know, through sneering and ridicule, and society as a whole. So there are these like reinforcement mechanisms that kind of like keep the status quo sort of ossified, and makes it really hard for these things to adjust. And I think one of the most powerful aspects of psychedelics, what they can do is they can actually take these really hardwired, ossified cultural indoctrinations and put them in a place of suspension, and put them in a place of malleability, put them in a place where there's a formative period where some of these deep-seated conditionings are now subject to revision. And I think in that formative period of rewiring, that formative period of reprogramming, I think that is where some of the strongest power of the psychedelics lie, is in that formative period. And I call it the formative period because it's not permanent. You know, people can have a psychedelic experience and then there is that brief period afterwards. You know, I don't know how long it is. You know, we could argue about how long that period is. You know, you could call it, you know, in the immediate weeks or months after the psychedelic experience. Sometimes it might even take years for people to integrate psychedelic experiences. But, you know, for the sake of simplicity, let's say like in the first few weeks after a psychedelic experience, you know, that's when a person is most receptive, and is in that state of heightened neuroplasticity where you're able to kind of reconsider, you know, these programmings, these conditionings, and in that state, that's when there's that increased flexibility to open one's eyes to a new set of ideas, a new set of understanding the world, and it might not even have to be in the aftermath of the psychedelic experience. Oftentimes, in the acute psychedelic state, it's when people have these ego dissolution experiences where these, I would even call certain aspects of, identity and culture are extensions of the ego. A person's social identity, how a person identifies with their social group, with their tribe, and the such, I would call these extensions of the ego. And, when the person's individual ego has this ego dissolution experience, there can also be a, concomitant, ego dissolution of the extended ego of a person's tribal identity, a person's, identity politics, and all these things are also kind of like put in a place of suspension and dissolution where they're kind of broken down and are able to be rebuilt back up with new knowledge and new information.
Might that be called the collective ego?
Sure. Yeah, you could call that the collective ego. And there's all these little...
Or a collective ego. There's several collective egos. There's this collective has an ego. And it's funny because when I say collective ego, my mind registers that as sort of oxymoronical, because when we use the word ego derogatorily, it's like you're being a fucking egomaniac. This guy's got so much ego. Recently, there was a president of the United States that I think many of us regard as a caricature of rampant ego. And these things are seen as a negative, I would say, by most of us. And then when we think collective, I mean, I know that there's obviously a camp that scorns collectivism and collectivist thinking, but like the collective or a collective, a community, that's a good word, right? And so there's a lot of anti-ego talk, particularly in like self-help, spiritual milieu. You say ego bad, right? Your ego is not your amigo. But there's I think that's precisely what I'd say, that culture can be, aspects of culture can be a sort of collective ego. And in order to not have these clashes and instead be like, because we're a lot of cultures, a lot of camps of collective ego are doing this right now. And what I observe psychedelics can do is to help us be able to do more like a merger, a coming together. Here's our ways in which we are distinct. Here's our values. Here's our, but also, and here's the things that fuse. Here's our cuisines. Here's our arts. Here's our the aspects of our respective cultures that we both appreciate, and it's very optimistic how exciting and fun it could be to the prospect of intentional integration. But you don't want to be, everybody, ideally we want integrative efforts to not be efforts, for it to be an organic coming together. But we're in this place right now with the world that we're in an awkward situation where it's like, we really oughta, it would be really good if there might need to be integrative forces, and a psychedelic human, or 12 million, I think is part of that.
Yeah,
art is huge in that.
Yeah, I would put it ontologically such that ego implies other. I think that what the term ego, or what the term self does, is self implies other, and it implies separation. And I think that one of the keystones of the psychedelic experience, of the ego dissolution experience, is this collapse of this duality. That we our whole lives, are kind of conditioned, through our own nervous system to perceive this separation of within and without, to perceive this separation of self and other and the rest of the ecosystem, the rest of society, and to take that and apply it individually. I feel like I have a self, and that my skin is a barrier between my organism and the rest of the universe. And one of the hallmarks of the ego dissolution psychedelic experience is that this duality collapses, and there's no longer this feeling of separation. There's no longer this feeling of within versus without. There is this kind of like oceanic oneness where, Alan Watts has so many great quotes that kind of like speak to this phenomenon where, you kind of understand that, you are a wave in the ocean, and you are a product of what the entire universe is doing, the same way that a wave is a product of what the entire ocean is doing. And you could take this and extend it onto the collective level. Your tribal identity, your in-group, separates you from the out-group. And in the psychedelic experience, there's kind of this realization that, this in-group versus out-group is actually an illusion. And we are ultimately one people. We're ultimately one consciousness. We're ultimately one organism. We are the universe. And I think tapping into those states of consciousness allows people to break out of this shell, to break out of the membrane of this in-group consciousness, and realize the unity between your tribe and the other tribe, and the global tribe. And I think that seeing past this dualism, seeing past this membranous thinking, and being able to understand the unity is one of the powerful things of the psychedelic experience.
Membranous. One of the things that happens often in my psychedelic experiences is that if one attempts to articulate oneself freely and honestly and quickly, it a lot of compound terms like membranous. Does membranous exist as a word yet? Or
I don't know. It might.
It
Maybe
may.
not.
It may. But also like fractally, for example, I cannot articulate what I'm experiencing in psychedelic states without using an adverb form of fractal. It is there is a what is it that Terence McKenna says is like the cascading visuals, and they're fractally coming simultaneously out of me and toward and with me. When you were saying that in regular old consciousness state, my skin is the barrier between myself, my body, and the world. And in say psilocybin state, particularly in high dose, that goes away. And the going from this is my body, that is the world, here am I, there are you, going from that state that that we're in right now. I'm in that right now. I can, because of both having a lot of psychedelic experience and also the sincerity and connectedness of this conversation, and the enthusiasm that I have for this topic, and the prospect of psychedelics assisting humanity, I'm intellectualizing to the point where I'm beginning to feel that dissolving of duality. But the thing with psychedelics that old naive adolescent Zachary going around saying like these things they do it, they just fix us, they fix the world. The one thing that he was right about and and something that Terence McKenna says in No Uncertain Terms is, yeah, you're not going to meditate yourself to that state. And I'm not, and I'm very open to having this proven wrong. And I know I've heard the stories of there was like the aesthetic, or the guru who like something like took you hear stories about like monks taking like 100 hits of acid and being like, oh yeah, that it's nowhere near what I experience in meditation, or them being like, yeah, that's kind of indistinguishable from how I just exist, and you hear things like that. And I'm not saying that anybody's lying. And I've talked with individuals, like I've had a conversation with a very thoroughly practiced meditator 12 on Clubhouse from all over the world, who will say that, yeah, I exist psychedelically because of my meditation practice. And I'm not saying that anybody's fibbing, but I'll tell you, as from my experience, there's something about the exogenous consumption of a molecule that I ain't getting to that state. You get close, you have moments. And this is what I think of the nature of reality, is that, and it's very interesting that the neuroscientists are saying this more and more, like very left brain, very like skeptical of pseudoscience and magic. I'm hearing more scientists saying, yeah, it's kind of like reality is, we're hallucinating. This is kind of like a dream. It's coming out of your head, but at the same time, the existence of your head is kind of an illusion, sort of thing. Anyway, stuff like that. It's like those moments of just like being in the cathedral of a literal cathedral, Sistine Chapel, the grand mosques of the world, the beautiful like structures that we've erected, that people talk about standing in the presence of like all that human effort and intricacy and beauty, that will can induce this mystical experience. But also the cathedral of nature, the temple of organic unfolding, as we say, nature, which is a very interesting concept. What is nature as opposed to not nature? What is organic as opposed to, and right now the working definition that we have for that is like, did thumb monkeys make it? Like, did humans have to do something in order for that to exist? So apparently this is not an organic iPhone. This did not sprout from a tree. It sprouted from a factory. So it's not nature, but we are nature. Anyway, what I was saying with that is that ego disillusion, both from the collective ego, as it were, of culture, and that felt sense of separation that I have of I am me, you are you, stay the fuck back, or let's dance, but there's you and a me dancing, as opposed to just this organism that is currently doing a thing. I intellectualize in, as we say, sober states, and I can induce endogenously the understanding of, and flickers and like little micro doses of that ego disillusion. But if I really want to obliterate the feltness of my forlorn separate existence, psychedelics are the way.
Yeah, and you're touching on some really important points, because there's the whole conversation about, how much of the, phenomenology of the psychedelic experience is accessible without psychedelics, and how much of it can be packaged and delivered, to, those in the sober state. And I think that it's an important conversation, because I think ultimately, yeah, I agree that there are so many aspects of the psychedelic experience that are innate to the psychedelic experience, and you really can't be duplicated no matter how much you try through meditation. And I think you articulated it perfectly. You could get little microdoses, figurative microdoses, through meditation, through contemplation, through this and that. But, to experience something of the full gravity of the psychedelic experience really just takes psychedelics. And of course, there are the exceptions. There have been the mystics of yore who spontaneously had mystical experiences, and, through really intense, inductions of altered states of consciousness through things like fasting for extensive periods, or other spiritual or ascetic modalities. You can access similar states of consciousness, and those are real. Those are definitely real. But I think it's true in a general sense that the best way to truly access the most powerful throes of the experience is to actually indulge in the psychedelic. I will just kind of, you mentioned the neuroscience, and me being the neuroscience nerd that I am, I'm just going to indulge in the opportunity to kind of speak to that a little bit. Earlier I had mentioned, the cultural indoctrinations that kind of get piled upon us, through birth and life and culture and society and stuff like that. Give me a second here. Yeah. We can kind of look at the micro scale phenomenology. So when I discuss that, you're born, and then immediately when you're born, you get put upon these, indoctrinations through your parents, through your culture, through your society, through your school, XYZ, etc. That's kind of like a macro level understanding of, the indoctrinations. But, let's take it even a more granular level and look at it with a microscope on a neurological level. So in the brain, in our cortex, we have these different information flows. We have a top-down information flow and we have a bottom-up information flow. And what those are, I'll start with the bottom-up. A bottom-up information flow is basically, we can call that, the raw sensory data. The raw information from your environment that you soak in and then gets processed. And then we have top-down information flows. And the top-down information flows are basically, what your brain already knows to be true, the patterns that your brain has already kind of like sussed out from the environment, the conditionings that your brain knows how to understand the world. And basically what happens is the top-down information flow regiments which of the bottom-up information flows cross through the threshold into your consciousness. So throughout your life, your brain kind of like forms these models. It forms these ways of regimenting the world through pattern recognition and whatnot. And it uses, this repertoire, this set of understandings and conditionings and fine-tunings and primings to modulate how much of the bottom-up information flow enters your brain. And, and that's how people get stuck in modes of thought, because the information that their brain allows them to process is literally regimented by their life experience. And that's one of the wonders of the psychedelic experience on a neuroscientific level, is that it actually perturbs this balance. It perturbs the equilibrium that your brain has kind of settled into, such that the top-down information flow is less able to regiment, the bottom-up information flow. So people are kind of like liberated from this cognitive filter that kind of like inhibits how they're able to think, and they're able to kind of like access a more raw feed of what the bottom-up information flow is from the environment. And that's how you can understand it on a kind of like a granular neuroscience level. There are so many other ways to talk about the neuroscience, but I'm aware that you wanted to kind of like steer the conversation in a focused way that speaks to pertinent geopolitical aspects. So if we want to take the conversation out of the abstract and kind of like more apply it to really concrete things in our universe, in our society. So I invite that opportunity. So if you want to take the mic,
that as well, because it's more than an elephant in the room. It's a stampede of mastodons and gigantic, Return of the King, Lord of the Rings, Final Battle, elephants there are trampling through our consciousnesses right now. I don't think there's no, I won't say that. There's people who probably live peacefully in the mountains who have no idea that. But well, humanity has some problems right now. It has some more than problems. Has some unleashing of momentums of we are currently in a current that leads to catastrophes, and there are catastrophes unfolding right now. And I wanted to take a moment to not disclaimer or apologize for how I tend to speak in a way that seems like I am emotionless about these things. I emote intensely and overwhelmingly in psychedelic states about these things. And now we are in conversation dialectic mode, and we're floating ideas about potentials. And I just wanted to say that I do regard the immense gravity of the things that we are about to speak about. And my intention, I think our intention is to possibly give to put words to how the topic, how psychedelics might assist with these things. And I know that there are those who, and I think they're wrong, but I also think they just haven't come into contact with these experiences and this information, and they've had their collective ego of enculturation around what they would call drugs. There's still just less and less in the good old U.S. of A. Very much less and less in the state of Michigan, where I'm from, and less and less with, say, like my parents. But there's definitely still a lot of humans who have just a ton of felt and intellectualized and collective ego enculturated stigma about drugs. And I know that to them, hearing this conversation of how are psychedelics going to help with something as intense and 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 catastrophically tragic as the current unfoldings I think that if I could suggest that we try to keep it to Ukraine, Russia, and Israel, Palestine, just because, and I know there's other conflicts in this world, and there's other, but it's very difficult for me not to. There's just too much to talk about, so I personally suggest that we keep it to those two. But yeah, how might psychedelics? And I'll just pose to you the question: how might psychedelics help with a situation as intense and tragic and deadly as the unfoldings in Israel, Palestine, particularly? I'll ask you, like, how
Okay.
might psychedelics help people to seek to solve a problem as opposed to win?
Okay.
Is that-
I think something such as the conflict in Palestine, I don't even want to call it a conflict, the situation in Palestine, that situation is so intractable, so forlorn, so despondent, that I think something like psychedelics is a really interesting way to step out and think outside of the box a little bit and kind of ponder how might they be an asset to the situation. I think they're definitely not a panacea, of course, earlier we talked about how we've all had that phase where we all conjured, if we just put LSD in the water supply and then just set it free, then all of our world's problems will be solved. I don't think that's the case. There are some really deep-seated issues and problems and power dynamics and institutionalized systems of racism and discrimination and violence and oppression that are going to take a lot more energy, a lot more political will, a lot more momentum to solve than by simply getting people to sit in a circle and sing Kumbaya, sipping ayahuasca together. But there are some ways that psychedelics can kind of breach the bubble of mistrust and create new novel modalities of thought that can kind of like usher in some sort of reconciliation. I just want to mention from the get-go that in Palestine and Israel, it's not a situation of equal conflict. It's a disproportionate and asymmetrical situation where there is a political entity called Israel that is dominating and oppressing another people, the Palestinians who had their homeland stolen from them by the Zionist project and are living either in brutal oppression and apartheid, military occupation, or living in exile, forbidden from returning to their home. And those on the Israeli side are, of course, a deeply traumatized people who are living in the shadow of the Holocaust. And they bear with them the deep psychological burden of that collective trauma. And that collective trauma on the Israeli side of undergoing one of the most horrific genocides of history, it has kind of, primed the Israeli psyche to be really paranoid, really suspicious, really fearful. There's the quote that the child abused becomes the child abuser. And it's kind of a really unfortunate situation where, a victimized people created victims of another people, and now have this, really strong power over the oppressed. And the oppressed, the Palestinians, are in a really despondent state where there isn't really much they can do to help their situation but resist. With that kind of framework out of the way, there have been some interesting inquiries and studies on how psychedelics have kind of interfaced with Palestinians and Israelis. There was a recent paper published, I forget the journal. I know one of the authors on the study was Robin Carhart Harris. I think was Rick Doblin one of the others. Let me do a huge favor and look up the article, because if anybody listening wants to look up the article,
Yeah, and I could take the mic while you do the search. I wanted to say that what the conversation that we're having right now is a hypothetical example of we are like a microcosm of what I believe is the way that psychedelics could assist with something as intense and extreme as warring, clashing cultures, areas.
I found it.
Using the wrong words there, to call it a war, but like ideally to have that conversation, it would I know that I could summon a friend who is just as learned and has been actively always informing themselves and participating, and could speak from the Jewish perspective. I know a friend who could even speak from the Zionist perspective, and I've also listened to a lot. I've listened to so much conversation via Clubhouse, particularly, and I've heard the people who are unrepentantly hateful, or at least disregarding of the humanity of what they see as the other side from both perspectives. And also I've heard the people who are really trying to help, and the difference that I see is whether you're coming to it as why so say like an Israeli saying, this is why we're justified, this is why we are defending ourselves, this is why we are paranoid, this is why we are drawing a hard line, this is why we just like, and then just trying to win an argument and a conflict, as opposed to when there are conversations that I have seen, gorgeous conversations of people trying to talk about how we can improve the situation. The current and what I like feel that like the the litmus test for me of is someone going to be helpful in this situation between Israel and Palestine is have to regard that you have to acknowledge that the current configuration is unsustainable. That this can't this there's so there's no just talking about just trying to justify why it is.
Yeah.
It's this is unsustainable. This and I can not mince words. Like this summer is probably going to have nightmarish spark points. There's almost unavoidable. Like the current configuration is not okay, and so then the litmus test of are you being helpful is how can we have to make things better. And
Yeah.
I know some people are saying really big things right now of talking about, like you said the other day, about like that it has to be the formation of some one state that is secular, that is a government that like highly regards the religious elements, and because that's these are very holy places to three major religions, but and it's something like that. And somebody who wants it to remain Israel would, obviously I could see somebody seeing that as being like, whoa, 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 reacting with but just the litmus test to me, if someone is helpful, I just wanted to say is you have to acknowledge the current configuration is not sustainable, is not all right, is not humane. It's not okay. It has to change. And then are you trying to change it in a way that that benefits both, that works for both people?
Yeah.
You have to regard both people as people.
Yeah, I found the article, by the way. It's published in Frontiers in Pharmacology. And the title of the article is Relational Processes in Ayahuasca Groups of Palestinians and Israelis. I think the first author is Lior Roseman. And I'll just list the first three: Lior Roseman, Yiftach Ran, and Antoine Saka. There are a few things that I recall from the article. It's been a while since I read the article. I'll try to speak to some of the things that stuck out to me from this article. But we are currently witnessing in Palestine what I would call the something that is a crux of tribalism, something that is a crux of in-group versus out-group, where either side, sees the other as the enemy. And that is just kind of like an obvious given that there is this very vicious, tribal separation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Notwithstanding all of the, the dynamics at play, I'll just speak to them briefly. Currently what's happening is that Israel has defined itself as an ethno-state. It has defined itself as a Jewish state that privileges the rights of the Jewish people. They see that they, because of centuries of Jewish persecution and oppression and not fitting in, wherever Jewish people have been in the world, and something that is a crux of tribalism, something that is a crux of in-group versus out-group. There's a bit of where not fitting in, wherever Jewish people have been in. Hang on, can you mute yourself real quick, Zach?
I don't know what happened there.
Okay, we're back. Okay, where was I? Yeah, Israel sees itself as the Jewish state. They see themselves as the abode of the Jewish people because of all the persecution, and that is to the expense of the other native people who live on the land, the Palestinians, who, that's also their ancestral homeland. It is the place that the Palestinians they resonate deeply within their bones. It is the place of their grandfathers, their grandmothers. And when you have this situation where there is a land where there is a diversity of people, but there is this imperative, this impulse to prioritize, the one ethnic group over the rights of another, that it fundamentally boils down to tribalism. And earlier in this conversation, we talked about how the psychedelic state can kind of like help dissolve these boundaries of tribalism. I think that's going to be a really important theme for how we approach this conversation. So in this paper that I mentioned, basically what it is, it's a qualitative study where, the meat of the paper basically takes stories, testimonials from Palestinians and Israelis who have sat in ayahuasca ceremony. So, different individuals, most of them Israeli, but there's also many Palestinians thrown in there too, have sat in ayahuasca ceremony. And they were subsequently interviewed and spelled out, their experiences. And the paper is really, really fascinating. I think it's worth a read at length because it's really hard to kind of convey and summarize and make succinct what people's personal stories are with the medicine, with the ayahuasca. But I will just highlight a few stories that stuck out to me. One of them was an Israeli who, through most of his life, was scared of Arabic music. He grew up, indoctrinated by fear. He, associated Arabs with terrorism and violence, and whenever he heard Arabic music, it inspired this feeling of this visceral feeling of fear, and he couldn't stand to hear it. But one time he was sitting in an ayahuasca experience, and he heard Arabic music, and then I think he saw some Palestinian people dancing and enjoying the music, and for the first time he had this really deep appreciation and love for Arabic music. For the first time, he was able to kind of like pierce through this veneer of fear and experience the Arabic music with a kind of like fresh lens and no longer colored by this deep-seated fear. He was able to kind of understand Arabic music and enjoy it and resonate with the love and the joy and the positive energy of the music and dance to it. And that's one of the powerful things that the medicine was able to accomplish for this individual. Was he was able to enjoy Arabic music. There's another really profound story from the testimonials in this paper, where there was an Israeli soldier who I believe, a former Israeli soldier who served at a high rank. He was a pretty high up there soldier when he was on duty, and he sat in ceremony in ayahuasca with a few Palestinians and Israelis. And in the middle of the experience, he saw a few, I might choke up a little bit. He saw a few Palestinians who were sitting together and crying together. And he witnessed, their collective trauma. And he witnessed, the collective psychic energy of the Palestinians, how they were feeling this collective trauma and this collective pain. And he had this vision. He had a flashback to when he was a soldier invading one of the Palestinian villages, a Palestinian town in the West Bank, where he was on duty and then performing an arrest. He was invading a house in the West Bank to arrest somebody. And then he remembers when he had invaded this house, he just conjured this scenario of these Palestinians were sitting at home having a good time, playing cards, drinking tea, having a good time with each other. And then all of a sudden, these soldiers barge in, and then the mood in the house completely changes from enjoyment into fear. And then he has this vision of seeing the Palestinians in the house, all of a sudden have their entire like vibe disrupted by these foreign invaders, these soldiers that just barge in the house and invade their space. And then these are his words, not mine. But for the first time, he was kind of like able to kind of like put himself in the Palestinian perspective. And in his words, he saw himself as this Nazi just stomping in and destroying the place.
Whoa.
And he was able to see himself as the enemy. He was able to see himself as the villain. He was able to step out of that complacent, cognitive dissonant state, and see himself, with the same lens of fear that the Palestinians did. And that was a huge turning point for him, because for the first time he understood the gravity of his actions and how that affected the others. He was able to see how his actions were impacting Palestinians, and I thought that was a pretty moving study from the paper, and I think that the paper is kind of like chock full of examples of this sort. But, what the ayahuasca does is it kind of like allows people to kind of like snap out of their illusions and be able to really understand the world on a visceral level from the eyes of others. And there are so many other stories from the paper that are so remarkable that I can't really think of on the spot, but I think it's really worth a read. It's worth reading the paper at length. And yeah, and to kind of like speak to this kind of like collapse in the tunnel vision of one's personal narrative, and to be able to experience another person's reality and integrate that into your worldview,
Yeah.
and step out of the the narrow prison of having this like really tribal worldview. And another thing that the paper mentioned is this strange concept of loving the enemy. And this is something that harkens back to what I'd mentioned about the Israeli who had never experienced positive energy from Arabic music, who had for the first time was able to appreciate Arabic music. And there is this notion, this repetitive notion that that surfaces in this paper of loving the enemy. And I think that this is going to be one of those hippy dippy cliches, and might make a lot of people roll their eyes, but the only antidote to hate is love. And to have the ability to, love the enemy is something that seems so bizarre and paradoxical, but ultimately might be, one of the only antidotes to this like really deep-seated, intractable conflict is just love. And, the way you acquire that is, through enjoying the other culture. And instead of having this kind of like indoctrinated notion of separation, this indoctrinated notion of us versus them, this indoctrinated notion of in-group versus out-group, to kind of have this this marriage of sorts, to kind of have this cultural cross-pollination where instead of sulking in this essence of separation and opposition, to open the chambers to merging and unity and integration. And that's why my solution to the situation in Palestine and Israel is a binational state where there is a one land for two peoples, where there's equal rights, rather than there being an institutionalized system of racism where one ethnic group, one in-group and enshrines their rights over the rights of another. I think a proper solution.
I have to say there,
what was that?
I have to say there that I'm not. Back when I was saying that we're a microcosm of what a constructed conversation would be, I just have to I have to acknowledge when you say that I already hear the Jewish perspective that is in me as a, like, I am meta aware of that perspective in the same way that I am like meta aware of like I know what I know what the like the an Israeli friend of mine would say, hold on there. There's a large Arabic population in Israel. That's, like, and I just like the separation that people experience. I noticed that Israelis and Palestinians who are only able to speak from the collective ego, from, like, their side, as it were, can't even use the same terms. There's always like, like, you can't, not, it's not a conflict. It's just a travesty upon, like, and I think that constructive conversation, part of it, because psychedelics there's a lot to do with language. There's a lot to do with, like the magic of language. I think agreeing to terms that work with both, of just how to even talk about this, like, and yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm not like in this moment, I'm not doing due diligence to speak from, I'm not towing the line of speaking from the Jewish perspective right now, because I know that at several junctures of, like, when you're speaking, I already, and I know this, like, in conflicts in America, like, I know what each side says, like, I know their talking points so well. And then it's like, I think that the constructive comment, I'm not saying that you're doing talking points at all, Ramzy. But I just wanted to acknowledge that this right now, for friends that might be listening, who would be like, I just can hear them being like, Zach, you're not standing up for the, like the Jewish perspective here enough, but you're doing your diligence to acknowledge the Jewish trauma, that, like, that story, man. I need to reread that article. That story of the Israeli being able to see himself as the oppressor, like, that's powerful. That's fucking, because when people say this, when people say it in anger, when they say that the oppressed has become the oppressor, it's like, yeah, you're goddamn right, and it's fucking tragic. It's like, that's how trauma works. That is horrible. Can't, so then I'm just, it sounds like there's anger in my voice, like that is where I think psychedelics can help, is like, to confront. It is so hard to confront the emotional overwhelm of how tragic this story is. This has been one of the great nightmares of history, and in order to wake up from the nightmare and to usher in peace and and embracing and integration, we're going to need help. I don't think we're going to need more than just the will of heroic actors. We're going to need more than just, like, there's not going to be one song or one film or one politician I honestly think that it's going to require things like that ceremony that you speak of, like, because it's just so tragic. It's just, and that's how that that disassociation, that cognitive dissonance, is the way we defend ourselves from falling to the earth and crying for hours, and psychedelics can help with that. I am so sorry to cut you off there. I just needed to drop that in there about when that I hear the voice in my head saying, Zach, if this is supposed to be somebody speaking from the Palestinians' perspective and somebody speaking from the Jewish, you're not towing the line. And I just want to say, I'm not right now. And I don't think that's what's helpful right now, is towing the line from a side, because I'm not on. I don't have a felt sense of being on a side in this. I just, from my safe, privileged American perspective, that I only have I don't have I have a very, very loosely felt Jewish identity. It's just an that ethnic. It's a factoid about my body, in my opinion, and my body and my psyche and perhaps my soul. I'm learning about, ancestry stuff, but I honestly don't get it yet. I don't get it. I don't understand how we are imbued with, like, experiences of past, like our ancestors. I don't understand that yet, but I just yeah, I just wanted to say I am not doing the thing right now where we are two people from either perspective having a conversation. We're talking about the topic of how psychedelics might help, you know.
And sometimes
And I think that
that's the most appropriate thing, is to let suffering speak, and instead of having this default schema of, oh, you have to let both sides represent their opinion. I spoke very early on in the conversation that I don't think it's a symmetrical situation at all.
no. It's
And
not.
and I think that we do need more spaces where the Palestinian side is allowed to voice their grievances and voice their suffering without the having to deal with the burden of the other side trying to have a competing narrative. And I think that competing narratives is something that kind of like undermines an ability to have productive conversations, because if what really happens is just becomes two people talking past each other.
Totally.
So I think I welcome the opportunity to have this just raw experience of letting what needs to be said be said.
Truly. Yeah.
But
Yeah, I guess I was just trying to I mean, maybe it was that I was like just heard the voice in my head that can see the way, because this is what makes me avoid this conversation a lot. And we have a mutual friend who has said before, like, yeah, I don't talk about it because it's impossible. It seems impossible to speak about it without in many people's perspective then putting yourself on a side. And and so what psychedelics can do is, and like with that ceremony, that ayahuasca experience with Israelis and Palestinians, seeing viscerally having the experience of each other's humanity and each other's uh, trauma, and the tragedy of it, without the my story versus your story, and the heady, often toxic conversations that I've heard a lot on. I've heard wonderful, very helpful conversations on Clubhouse, and that's where we met, even though we've lived. No, yeah, no, we didn't meet on Clubhouse. Anyway, like on Clubhouse, there was hours and hours and hours of Israelis speaking with Palestinians, and and then there'd be these waves, right, of like, there's a wave of, this is getting really constructive, this is getting really integrative, and this is getting, and exactly what you speak of, which I fully agree. It's a very similar situation with like with the Native American and Black American like story, that there's moments where it's like you just have to allow people to 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 articulate their suffering without these moments of like these fact checking moments that might have seemed like I was even doing there, because when something is so asymmetrical and there is someone like that's. But man, I guess I just wanted to say this shit is so, like, I just wanted to make it clear, like, because like to the topic of what we're talking about right now is how psychedelics might help. It is so hard to get out of your head and into your heart about something like this, like, just like, it's this story is fantastically tragic. You
yeah.
have
And I think one of the most important steps for any sort of reconciliation, and this is beyond psychedelics, I think one of the first steps is that the Israelis have to recognize the historic injustice they've inflicted on the Palestinian people. One of the most prescient isn't the word, one of the most present things that I experience in many situations of discourse is rampant denial of what has happened to the Palestinians. A lot of the Zionist narrative is mythologized. You talk about what happened in 1948. There is this mythologized story of how the Zionists just were there, and then all of a sudden all the Arab countries attacked them, trying to drive them into the sea, and blah blah blah. And it's just all like it really just skips past the fact that the land was colonized by the Zionist movement, and then Palestinians were living on their indigenous land. And then these outsiders all of a sudden arrived, declared that, oh, this is our land now, and then drove Palestinians off of their land. And there's a lot of denial. There's a lot of denial of what happened to the Palestinians, and kind of like tries to flip the script in a way that portrays the Arabs as the aggressors. And I think that one of the first steps, one of the first things that has to happen before any reconciliation is that the suffering that has been inflicted upon the Palestinians has to be recognized, has to be acknowledged, and has to be remediated. And in a lot of Zionist milieus, it's really far from that, it's just like either denial or straight up victim blaming.
It's I think it exemplifies the thing that is the difference between the emotionally constructive story and that of just intellectualizing and staying in the head. Because I already hear, I know that how this works usually, how this conversation goes, and I know that even the most, I was going to say the most well-meaning Zionist, but that sounds oxymoronical from the other perspective. I'll just say, like, there are people who I hear the voice that says, "Wait, hold on. Here's what happened on this date. Here's this, that," and then it's like, what the fuck does that have to do with? Oh wait, I'll stop myself from shouting. It's like one very constructive part of it, and the way psychedelics can help is that there needs to be a full-scale, wholehearted acknowledgement of the suffering and of and the tragedy, and I don't see many people sans psychedelics being able to do that.
Yeah.
And politicians, I think, like, this is the thing that seems super pie in the sky still, but I think we're getting there. We're getting there. We're like, in the US, we're getting close to, lots of decriminalization and legalization, and then after that comes destigmatization, and then with that, and then legitimization of being a psychedelic person, as it were, and to have psychedelically empathic politicians, and for the body politic itself, that's what I think that we would be in total agreement. The body politic of Israel Palestine, which I think we both agree. I'm thinking more and more that it's the eventual optimal way for it to go. I do think is one state that fully regards both, not just both peoples, but all the peoples who see that land as holy and special.
Yeah. There's one thing I want to add real quick, which is that in most cases when Palestinians and Israelis had these experiences with ayahuasca, for people to have experiences that kind of like are conducive towards this understanding and this empathy and this reconciliation, the people who were imbibing kind of like had to have this intentionality towards a reconciliatory attitude, because there were also situations where people who came from, let's say, a far right wing predisposition had experiences that only reinforced their right wing dispositions.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's another reality that we have to acknowledge, is that a person's prior set, their mindset, what you're working with is definitely going to influence the experience. And
that's heavy as fuck, man.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. I mean, well, not just heavy. That's like, that's several things that we've said in this conversation have like now things that I need to integrate. And that is one of them, that you people who have an identity, it's not just having an identity from an extremity or just side of anyone, to identify as left or right or center or somewhere in between, or kind of oscillating as I do these days, but always staying near the center and definitely with a left lean, but whatever the hell. Like my mind is set in a way where I'm seeing the world through a lens, and somebody who is extreme right, who has extreme right-wing lens or left-wing lens, they're gonna Yeah, and I never thought of it that way before, that you could take, say, ayahuasca and have a right-wing ayahuasca trip. But I'm thinking about all of the people that I've ever talked to and about their trip reports and things, and that is kind of what happens. You That's your set, that's part of your set and setting. That's profound and
Yeah. Um,
useful.
I recommend, yeah, I said this 3 times already, but I recommend reading the article at length. And also, a couple of the authors of the article did a podcast. I forget which podcast it was. I think it might have been the Plant Medicine podcast, or don't quote me on that. But yeah, just like use a search engine and look up a podcast. And I think just Palestinians, Israelis, ayahuasca podcast, and I think you'll find it. I think it's not too long of a podcast. It might be somewhere between 30 minutes to an hour, something like that, where the authors kind of like run through, what stuck out to them. And I think their podcast is worth a listen. It's really great. I actually, when I was listening to the podcast, I started bawling. It really hit me. It really hit me
Dude,
really hard.
that,
And
that allegory of the guy seeing himself as a Nazi stomping around is so profound. That is so intense. My God. So yeah, you just if you just Google, or if you're listening to this decades in the future, then whatever the current word for searching is, Israelis and Palestinians ayahuasca, it'll come up. And there's several things here. It seems a psychedelic spotlight: Israelis and Palestinians turn to ayahuasca to heal conflict wounds. Yeah, that's profound. I wanted to, if I may, I think that's just because we're getting to the close to the hour and a half, we have 15 minutes left. And I did mention that there would be just something about Ukraine, Russia, tied into this topic of how psychedelics may assist. And I just wanted to say, I was having a conversation with a friend the other day about the geopolitical chessboard, which I know is a very not emotional way to look at it, but we're talking about it, in those terms. We're in the head and not the heart about the world and the different moving pieces, and I know that is the super toxic and deadly way that a lot of the world leadership sees it, as the geopolitical chessboard. But in one regarding Russia, Ukraine, he said that I'm very concerned that the that Russia, after all this is said and done, and after being ostracized by the whole world so unanimously, and possibly, and I think he used the word hopefully, which I think many of us would agree with that, they lose, that they ultimately lose this war, that he's concerned that the Russian people will have a similar collective psychological scarring as that of Germany post World War I. And it was like, wow, that is intense. And then it's like, we know what happened there, right? So when I think, how could psychedelics assist humanity regarding that conflict, that war, that psychological scarring that is already ensuing at this very moment. There's people being traumatized, and in different ways, in like Russian people are gonna hurt for this across years, across decades, so there's just no way around it. And then the very obvious suffering of the Ukrainian people, and then the very obvious suffering of both soldieries, fighting and dying. And I know that, your mind might be thinking right now, well, these are the obvious villains, and these are, but it's like, at the end of the day, what you have is humans waging death upon each other. It's very traumatic. So I think it is sadly too late for psychedelics to assist. I don't think we're going to dose Putin's coffee, and that he's going to come on TV and be like, hey, super sorry. Nope. I think that it's all about the how post-war. And that thing that my friend said, that he is concerned about a similar psychological scarring as but I think that's even with the Ukrainians too, a similar psychological scarring. But it's just that his concern makes more sense for Russia being the
Well,
superpower, you know.
you
But
know,
anyway,
if I can chime in real quick, um, you know, I will speak to what happened in the United States in the '60s. We were at war in Vietnam, and what had happened was psychedelics had kind of like escaped from the laboratory. They escaped from the universities, and they were just unleashed onto the public. And this spurred a psychedelic revolution. And one could even argue that this is what catalyzed the hippie movement and the anti-war movement and a lot of other revolutionary movements of the 60s. And there was a large contingent of the population of the youth that were all of a sudden taking acid and recognizing the insanity of fighting a war in Vietnam. And this was spurring so many protests, so many just people just like tapping out of, the expectations of society and questioning things and be like, why are we fighting a war in Vietnam? Why are we sending our youth, to the other side of the planet to fight this war that we don't understand? And it was creating a seismic shift in how society was perceiving the war in Vietnam. And this is ultimately what led to the war on drugs. This is what led to the blowback in which Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, because he was seeing just how powerful these substances were in creating a seismic shift in the collective consciousness. And, you had mentioned that, maybe the psychedelic remediation in Russia might have to be after the fact, but, who knows? What if, there is a psychedelic revolution now in Russia where a lot of the youth start taking acid just like the 60s and start realizing, hey, what the hell are we doing in Ukraine? That's something you can also put on the table as well.
Well, I think there's also see this is the thing that I've just come to just know is you just cannot characterize a country of millions of people. And of course, there are throngs, there are millions of Russian citizens who knew from the get-go, who knew when it was just a whisper of possibility that this was dead wrong, and that have empathy for those that are billed to them as their enemies. And I know that that's true of Ukrainians too. And of course there's people taking mushrooms and acid and already like feeling the tragedy of this. But I do think that largely because it's already happening, and that's terribly sad. But to avoid that concern that my friend said, which I will try to articulate one more time, he said, I am concerned that there will be a similar collective psychological scarring on the Russian people after this war, after they are, defeated and cut off from the world economically. That there will be a similar there'll be economic scarring as well, but psychological scarring that may fester in the same way as Germany post their defeat in World War One. And we all know how that went.
Contingent upon how do I say this? How involved and how rampant the propaganda is in Russia. If I understand correctly, the propaganda as we now see it in Russia is pretty strong. There's definitely a lot of censorship, a lot of control over the information that people in Russia are allowed to have access to. And that is that's part of the tragedy of the whole situation, is that, the Russian government kind of controls what people are allowed to think. They control what type of information people are allowed to have access to. And that is tragic. And, this can become a broader philosophical conversation about, freedom of thought and freedom of information and freedom of speech and stuff like that. And it really is tragic. War is hell. There's that undeniable quote that war is hell. And, you had mentioned, this notion of, after the fact, people having this same psychological scarring of of Nazis after the fact, but does the United States, do we as Americans have that same psychological scarring over what this nation did in Iraq? Because the war in Iraq was completely unnecessary and vicious and brutal and destroyed the country, killed so many civilians. I'm not sure if you witnessed George Bush's recent
Oh my
Freudian
God.
slip.
Yes, I did.
Oh
Holy.
my God, that Freudian slip. Oh my God.
Oh God. It's like take him away in cuffs. Like it's like there should have been handcuffs. Should have clicked right then.
Oh my gosh,
Oh my
his chuckle
God.
and his facial expression after that Freudian slip, I
Right.
crack up.
So we should say what it is, but okay, I'm going to read that quote of that George Bush Freudian slip. I did want to say that is very much that what you just said, the psychological scarring. That is the story of United States veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan who there is so much. I was going to say data, but there's so well documented stories, accounts of people of veterans have benefiting from psychedelic therapy and ceremony for their psychological scarring, and it's like now these things have totally not reached, are going to have a more difficult time reaching, say, like the Muslim world, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's where it's very much where it's about, we're talking the future and we're talking tremendous efforts. I think that the process of the way that would go, like say with my friend's concern about the psychological scarring being similar to that of Germany post World War I, like in order for psychedelics to be a factor or a big factor of avoiding a new superpower having Nazi-like orientation and God forbid action, that seems feasible, right? That intentionally psychedelics would then be applied to helping people minds not to fester down that path, and then to help for it to to seep into the body politic is ultimately like, these are big hypotheticals, and some people saying
one
optimistic.
One theme that we keep coming back to in this conversation is this, what I might call congruence of the micro scale and the macro scale, because a lot of times what happens on an individual level when people have a psychedelic experience is this confrontation with the shadow, and getting past it is having the ability to recognize the shadow, to look it in the face and integrate the shadow. And this also applies on the collective level, to be able to, as a society, see the collective shadow and to be able to integrate it and recognize it. I agree that there is this, it's necessary. It's necessary for collectives, for communities, for societies to be able to acknowledge the suffering they've inflicted and take it to heart, and to understand the severity and the gravity of it, and understand what they've done, and to reconcile with it. And that's part of the process of healing. Part of the process of redemption is to recognize the shadow and look it in the face.
Yeah. So we're coming to the end here. I wanted to just say that the big, and this is the sentence that I have found through this conversation. I mean, there's several things that I need to intellectually and emotionally integrate that we came across today. This has been tremendous, Ramzy. That I think that the way that this goes, this is just to me to fly the arrow of a potential imagined optimistic way for things to go, which I think is very important. I think many have said, but I know Terrence McKenna said in some way, that you need to be able to imagine the future. You need to be able to imagine the possibilities in order for it to become reality, right? You need to first, it must be imagined. I wanted to say that I think that the way this goes, I'm going to say it as if I'm saying I think this is what's going to happen. The United States will continue to decriminalize and And I'm coming from a very American perspective right now, and I'm just going to do so unrepentantly. And I know that I talk to many people from around the world who say that there's something where something begins in the U.S. and then like there's some functionality that this has of like this melting pot, this multi-ethnic hub of where all of the peoples of the world have come. And obviously there's other places like that, but this is what I see happening. From my perspective is the United States of America will continue to decriminalize and eventually legalize these molecules, these medicines, I know that Dr. Carl Hart says
just call them drugs.
Medicines will do it. Yeah, let's call them drugs. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That we're going to legalize and then legitimize the potential benefits, therapeutic and sociocultural, by seeping into the body politic, as I've said, of these drugs. And then when it is thoroughly established through data, through like well-documented data that we all know is coming now, we just know that it's going to be made very clear how these things help, how they, veterans, for example, is the way that like Rick Doblin and company like knew that was the path to decriminalization and legalization. We can show them how these will save our wounded soldiers, psychologically and physically wounded soldiers, from suicide. It was clear that they were killing themselves so much, and then by employing these drugs, that they not only weren't killing themselves, but were no longer meeting the criteria for PTSD. That's tremendous. And so through data, post decriminalization, and as we legalize and then legitimize these substances, these experiences, these pathways, these tools, then with the example of Russia, Ukraine post-war, perhaps, to then employ them in a way, to very specifically be like, we need to find a way to get this medicine to the people, as it were. I see that as plausible, and I think it's happening.
Great. Well, I think that's a great note to wrap this up. Yeah, thanks for the conversation, Zach. This has been a great joy, and I look forward to continuing the conversation and diving more deeply into it.
Thank you, Ramzy. And thank you, everyone, for listening, both presently and on all future timelines. Happy reality, everybody.